Thank you for joining us for this library leadership webinar hosted by the Colorado State Library, the community-centered library with special guest Jamie LaRue. This webinar is meant to be interactive to help you better understand the concepts and the ideas being shared. So I hope that you'll participate in the chat and the other interactive tools throughout the webinar. Our presenter today is Jamie LaRue, a leader in the library profession who also happens to call Colorado home. Some of you may know Jamie from his work with the Office for Intellectual Freedom at the American Library Association, or you may know him from his years serving as the director of the Douglas County Libraries from 1990 to 2014. More recently, Jamie has been known as a speaker and consultant working with libraries on strategic planning, leadership development, and community engagement. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jamie and hand the mic over to him now.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm just going to kind of jump right into some of this. Let me see which slides come up first, and then I will try to advance it. So today we're going to be talking about turning outward, which is a topic that's been kicked around professional circles for the past probably 10 years now. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be a community-centered library in practice? How do we make it happen, and where do we start? So before I kind of jump into some of that, what I want to do is to find out where you are in the organization. And you'll see up along the top left-hand ribbon at the top of your screen, there's a microphone that's kind of flashing, and then there is a little person with their arm raised. And as I specify what role you have today, I wonder if you could pull that down and just raise your hand. So those of you who are directors, please indicate that right now. So pull down the little hand raising icon and raise your hand. And I'm not seeing that. Okay, there it is. And now how many of you, so if you'll clear that for me, Kristen or Crystal, how many of you then are supervisors, but you're interested maybe in being a director one day? Okay, looks like we have a little bit of mix of that. Good. And how many of you are trustees? That is to say, you serve on boards, either governing or advisory, for the library. Okay, very pleased to see that too. And how many of you are friends or volunteers? And then, of course, we may have one or two people there that have wandered into this particular webinar and have no idea why they're here. But maybe we can make that clear as we go along. So now let's talk about what do we mean by a community-centered library. And Christine, I believe we had a poll here too. Is this, can you insert the poll right now? So as you take a look at your own understanding of community issues, I've kind of given you a continuum here. And I just want you to click on the one that best captures where you are. At the one end of the continuum is you don't have much of a handle on community groups or the issues. Second one is that you do know some of your patrons, but you don't know how representative they are. Third one is in the middle that you interact with the patrons and maybe you belong to a few community groups. Next level is that you are systematically scouting out community groups and issues to see where you have common cause. And then this last one is, yeah, you're working pretty hard at it. And between library outreach and your own efforts, you really know quite a bit about your community. And I just want to give that a moment to see how things come out. And I guess it's not surprising that we're seeing that a little more than a third of you at this point, because we've been writing and talking about this in the profession for the past decade or so, you're starting to say that maybe this is part of our job. And the rest of you maybe haven't quite got there yet. And let me talk a little bit about why that would happen. For those of you who are indicating that you really don't have much of a handle on community groups or the issues, I think quite often the reason that happens is that you're new to town. You're really, really busy with family or hobbies or other activities, or you just haven't thought much about the issue. So welcome to this meeting, and I hope that by the end you'll be at least persuaded that you should step a little farther along this continuum. And for those of you who say you know some of your regular patrons, but you don't know how representative they are, what I have found through a lot of data gathering, particularly by the American Library Association, many people believe, many librarians believe that they serve, quote, everyone, because our policies say we provide access to everyone. But that doesn't mean that everyone comes to the library. And what we're finding is that for a general kind of statement, somewhere between 35 and 50% of the community is going to find us just when we open our doors. But the ones that don't come might be significant folks within your community that have their own issues, that they look to the library for some assistance. This next one, I interact with library patrons who belong to a few community groups. This is the beginning of engagement. This is how you are now thinking about who comes to the library and who does not, and you begin to explore other either influential or overlooked groups. So that's kind of the beginning of real awareness. Number 4, about systematically scouting out community groups and issues. That starts to look like both a personal and a library goal. Now you are approaching the issue professionally. And finally, this business about really being an expert about your authorizing environment of the community. That's what it means to be community-centered. So thank you so much for taking that poll. So now we'll go back to this idea about what do we mean by community-centered library. And back when I became a library director for the first time, I really thought that my measure of success was so everybody would think how important the library was. And without me having to do very much at all, they would say, oh, let me shower you with money. What I found is that's not a particularly effective way to guarantee support. And then when I said, well, and if I started talking to people to say, as many of us would begin saying, gee, I'm interested in how the library can help you, what can the library do for you? What I discovered was that most of the people in the community don't spend their time thinking about the library. They don't know what it is that we're supposed to do with them. So my next kind of big understanding was that, so if it didn't work just to hang out, and my library-centric approach, what can the library do for you, really wasn't giving me anything important. And I decided that just showing up all the time and saying library, 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 pounding my fist on the table and saying give us money, people start to avoid you when you act like that. And so one day I had this epiphany. It is not the job of the library, it is not the job of the community to make a great library. They have many, many other things that they're thinking about. And so as you look around the community, and if any of you have ever been involved in a pitch for funding before a town council, at county commissioners, or at the ballot box, you know that there are many, many people in the community who are also doing good work. They're also asking very good questions, and they're also looking for some money. So what I learned from this is that we're not the only kid on the block, and that in fact, it is the job of the library to make a great community. That we are one of many things that are being funded by that entire community. And of course, it has to be balanced against many other things. So this idea about what we do as librarians, we advocate for literacy. We advocate for intellectual freedom. We advocate for a community that values and creates new knowledge. All of these things are worthwhile. But a connection to the real people's concerns, that the things they actually care about, that's the beginning of relevancy. That's a beginning of a demonstration of the library as a social asset. And just as businesses advertise, libraries need to do some promotion as well. But we also have to work to build strong relationships that both acknowledge and authorize the good work of many community players. And so now we'll be talking a little bit about how to get to that. So, my next question for you, and this is in the chat, so why bother? I've talked about why some of these other things weren't doing much good for me, but in your opinion, why does this shift towards not library-centric focus, but community-centered librarianship? Why bother? Why is it worth doing? So I'm looking over to the chat box to see probably the reason that brought you here. And I see a couple of you beginning to type. And I will wait for you to, some of these things to surface. And I'll indicate too that among the things that I've heard many librarians say in the past, kind of as we're starting to see here, is gee, people just don't think about the library. We're not at top of mind. And we want to find a way to bring more value to the community. Or, as some of you are saying here, that we want to find experts in our community that we can surface through discussions with them so that they can provide programming and partnerships. We want to stay relevant to the community about all the generations. And we want to indicate that we actually care about the community. Meet the needs. How do you know what their needs are if you don't talk to them? And yes, point here is that the ideal state of the library is when we're providing information services to as many people as possible, not just the ones that happen to show up. So the way I'll summarize this, and feel free to keep putting some things out there and we'll try to mine these for content later. The two big possibilities that I hear, why people care about this in the first place, is we are driven by service. We want to make a difference. And we've known for a long time that we find deep satisfaction in personal service that we provide to the patrons who come into the library. But it's also coming to our attention that our communities need us for some big issues that no one was thinking to bring to the library. We want to identify those issues and make a difference. And then finally, just a little touch of library-centric here, if we have greater visibility, if we can demonstrate that we are making the lives of the people around us better, we're more likely to get the support from them. And that just means that we are a more effective community partner to make things happen. Okay, so now let's talk about some very specific ways that we have to begin to affect this change from turning inward to turning outward. In most libraries, the staff is by far the most significant expense. It's at least 50% of a municipal library. It might be 65 to 80% of some other libraries, district libraries, county libraries. According to OCLC, from awareness to funding, and I'll see if I can't figure out a way to plug this in as we go along. There was a study done by OCLC in 2008 and repeated in 2018 that found that in general, library advocacy has not been successful. For up to the period of about 2008, we were increasing in use, but decreasing in support. And there's the link. Thank you so much, Christine. Every library board in America should take a look at this because it articulates in a very clear way the difference between marketing for use and marketing for support. We need to begin to turn this around. But the number one thing that actually determines whether someone will vote to give the library money in a ballot or will reach into their own pocket to give it as a fundraising effort really comes down to their last interaction with someone who works at the library. And when the public says library staff, they don't know or care necessarily that that person has an MLS. They know that the person is working at the library, and if they demonstrate enthusiasm, competence, a passion for service, then the reputation of the library is strong, and people are more likely to support it. I was asked some years ago to come up to a library in Wyoming, and a very ambitious new director had just taken over and put together a long-range plan and started off where we're going to modernize our technology. So a lot of money and effort went into that. They were very successful. We're going to do some building improvements. They took care of the building improvements. We're going to go out and now we're going to try to make more partnerships with our community. And 2 years into that project, I was called by the director to say, we're just not making any progress with this at all. We don't have any visibility or awareness of the library's programs. Nobody thinks of us as a solution to anything. I wonder if you could come and have a workshop for us to talk about this. So my kind of break the ice discussion at the beginning of this talk was to say, I wonder if you can give your name and position and then tell me which community groups you belong to. And it could be I just go to church once a week or whatever it is that you are a part of in the community. And as we went around the table, this group of very bright, very committed, very dedicated library staff, every one of them said, no, I really don't belong to anything. And so before I could even debrief that, I looked over at the director and he gave a sad little nod and he said, okay, I get it. So I wanted to talk about something that I have this belief that there is kind of a theory of thirds. Whenever some significant new direction pops up within an organization, particularly within a library, 1/3 of your staff will say, I've been waiting for this moment all of my life. They don't have to be persuaded. They get it. 1/3 says, I don't know if I can do this, but I trust you enough to say if you give me some training, if you'll hold my hand, I think we can get there. I think I can figure this out. And then 1/3 pretends to be one of those other thirds. But the truth is, they don't believe it. They, in fact, are kind of passive-aggressive about it, and they might even be sabotaging that direction. The problem is, even if a supervisor or director has the courage and the authenticity to confront that final third, to say we can't pay you to stay here and work against us. And even if that third leaves, you're still left with the difficulty of how do you bring on new people that fall into one of those other thirds who are enthusiastic supporters of this. And so I think that the key in many respects here winds up being recruitment. And so how do we identify people in the community? So often we're looking at something like this. Many of the people who find jobs in libraries saw the ad in a newspaper. And many of these ads are deadly dull. A typical newspaper ad would be what you see here. Library clerk, detail-oriented person sought to maintain library inventory records. Some customer service experience must be neat and well-spoken. And I wonder if I can look over here to the chat to say, what does this ad say? What does this ad say about the library? And what kind of person do you think is liable to apply for that job? So I'm looking over at the chat here to see what you have to say about this. Quiet introvert. Yes, I was actually at a meeting of a bunch of library educators, and I was astonished when they said one of the big trends happening for library school recruitment, and I can't speak to this in Colorado, but this is kind of a national thing, is that more and more people who fall on the autism spectrum are applying for libraries. And I think that that's because early on in their maybe high school careers, they're being told, oh, this is a nice, quiet place. And so, yes, what we're seeing, this is a very old school ad. It is very traditional. It is rule-oriented. The idea is that, at first, the job doesn't sound very interesting. We don't know what we mean by customer service. The neat and well-spoken is basically quiet and well-behaved. And you're going to wind up with people who are looking for a nice, quiet time. So what happens if we did something a little bit different? And often, again, when somebody enthusiastically shows up at the library because of an ad, it's because something in that ad spoke to their aspirations. And I'm not saying that this is, the perfect ad and obviously doesn't have information about how you should apply or the fact that you're EEOC or any of that. But this idea of a question, are you passionate about a community that thrives? Curious about the issues that define people's lives? Do you live to connect people to each other and the resources that help them solve real problems? This kind of ad is just more likely to speak to somebody's aspirations. And so as I'm seeing in the chat, the people who thought it was a secretary job, the people who thought a little bit of customer service was fine, the people who thought it was an old school library and would not apply. Well, now the person who says, I am just fascinated by my community and I'm trying to find ways to connect them to each other and to these resources, that second ad is going to flush them out. So again, begin by seeking, by identifying the thing that you're looking for. You want people who are curious not only about the library job, but about how it fits within this larger community. So recruitment is necessary. So the problem is, again, how do we articulate? So somebody shows up and says, okay, I read this ad and I believe myself to be very community oriented. And now I'm going to ask back here in the chat session, so the best interviews don't just say, tell us why you're a wonderful person. They kind of put you in a spot where you have to demonstrate that. Well, how do you do that? I wonder if anybody has any ideas about ways that you could find out from one of the applicants that showed up, whether or not, in fact, they were connected to their community. So that might be things that they bring with them. It might be some questions that get at that. And so I'm just going to give you folks a moment here to type along. Most of the people that ask these kinds of questions, somebody Googles up what are good interview questions, and they look for something wild and wacky. And you've got a few folks who say, yeah, I've looked up some of the answers, and I'm prepared to do that. And one of our comments here is that, okay, well, ask about volunteer experience. So tell us about a day in the life of your volunteer experience, and ask them for some examples. Or another thing that I have done in the past is I say, well, can you bring in something that's kind of a portfolio? So let's say you claim to have been connected to a bunch of other community organizations. Show up with a portfolio. I was part of this event, and here's a newspaper clipping of it, and here's my photograph in the paper. Yes, I organized this, and here's the invitations that I sent out. So we can see, or here are letters of recommendation from the organizations that you've worked with. Yes, tell us about what you've done in your free time. Tell us about a difficult patron. Well, the question here is that, describe dealing with a difficult patron. That certainly gets at the customer experience, but it doesn't necessarily get at their community connections. And so I think it's really important for us to say, demonstrate some knowledge. And one of the questions that I have is to say, can you describe for us the communities, groups whose interests you could represent to us and to whom we could represent library interests? And so maybe they can say, well, yeah, it's one or two. And you begin to judge us by the number of groups that they're connected to. And you're looking for communities and insight. And I see here, there is a quick question here, and I'll stop a couple of slides in just to go back and make sure we've caught things here. But there's a question about the community and how to increase their interest in the library, and I will definitely be getting to that. I think if you get people who are already interested in the community and they're talking about those issues, plus some of the other systemic approaches that I've got here, you'll see that the library becomes way more interesting to them because it represents the things that they're trying to accomplish in the community. So again, what I'm looking for is the best question is, describe to us the community groups you already belong to and give us some names. And it very quickly becomes obvious who's good at it. So the bottom line is the takeaway that I want you to get from this one. The staff is the most visible face of the library. And if they are not connected to the community, if they're only looking inwards, then the library is always going to feel like it's a visit to an island that might be very safe and feel like a good sanctuary, but still isn't going to connect to all of the many people who may not know about the library. So the best predictor of success about how connected your staff will be is how connected they have already been. So look for folks that have those kinds of connections to the community. Okay, now let's talk about the next kind of human relations, human resources side of this, and that's the board. When I first went to work for one of my libraries, I have to admit that even though they liked me well enough when they hired me, I had a really rough first 2 years. And what that meant was they really didn't interfere with me much during the month, but when we got together for a board meeting, there was this kind of snide sniping at me, well, how come you didn't tell us you were going to do this, or how come you did it that way when I wouldn't have done it that way? And I felt very kind of put upon, but then they left me alone for another month. And then it happened that this is a library district, and this library district at that time had the ability to go out and recruit its own board members, do its own interviews, and then recommend appointment, which was typically accepted. And so I asked them if I could give them some questions for the interview. And the question was, I wonder if you can describe to me all of the community groups that you belong to, because we're just interested to find new ways that the library could serve our community. And many of the people who did this says, oh, I love the library. Almost everybody began with that. I love the library. I use the library, which you might think was very important. But some of the people who came, two of them in particular, said, I don't use the library all that much because it's kind of out of the way for me. But I value it for what it does for the community. And then they started listing all the community groups they belong to. And when they ran out of fingers, it was perfectly obvious to the rest of the board that that expertise, that level of engagement, wasn't something we had, and it was something that we needed to have. And what I found was bringing on just 2 people was enough to shift the whole dynamics of the board. And I began to ask at kind of informal meetings when we would have a board luncheon, I would say, just want to do a quick community check. What are you hearing in the town of? And then I would look at that board member to say, I know you're involved in a number of the groups there. What's going on with that? And it fundamentally changed the way that we did business. Now, instead of just everybody looking in at the library to see what was going on there, it was like, well, what new initiatives are going on around us? And who are the emerging movers and shakers within our community that we should be talking to? And it was transformative. So again, this idea about trying to submit questions is, you may be restricted from that. You may not have the ability to do it, but I firmly believe that if you should be in stalking mode all of the time to find good, well articulate, Board members who are, as I'll get to in a moment here, also have some other skills. So this might be a spot, Christine, we're going to have to come and explain how to use this whiteboard. What I've got here is 5 potential board members, and I want those of you who are in the audience to kind of think about what you think you need. So the first applicant is a parent who connects to the library and the neighbors through story times, new person in the community. They just love to be there. Next one is the president of the Chamber of Commerce, doesn't use the library much, but knows everybody, knows the business community particularly well. There's an active church member of the largest library in the community and has a strong service ethic. You have a head of a local nonprofit involved with educational support and homelessness. And you have a really articulate teen who's in the debate program and has political ambitions. So Christine, wonder if you can talk about how to put a check mark or a loop on the whiteboard.
Okay. Somebody has already kind of figured it out, but basically you all should, in between where your names are listed and the slide, you should see a strip of drawing tools. The second one down is a marker, and you can click on that, and you can put a check mark or a circle or some sort of indication according to who you would pick. We have also discovered that people just like to draw on slides, so we'd like to add a little bit of levity and fun to some of our sessions.
That's fun. Okay, good.
All right.
Yeah, I love that. Well, so the point is, you can kind of fill in the gender, the race, the sex orientation, or identity to kind of suit yourself. What's the right answer? And the answer is, it depends. And so it might be that you're looking at this to say, in that first category, a third of our business, 40% of our business is driven by storytime moms. And we don't have anybody on the board, and so we want to figure out someone who actually can help us with that. The second one might be, every time I meet a business person, they say to me, oh, my kids love the library, but they don't do anything for me. And it could be that kind of outreach might be a really good way for a library to begin to broaden its circle of influence. Next one is we often skip over faith-based members of our community, and yet very service-oriented, often with some other resources and places and an opportunity for us to make a connection to a number of people within the community. And the notion about a nonprofit, so I am just astonished. I have yet to be in any place that doesn't have hundreds of not-for-profits that nobody knows about that might be working with an issue that is a very hot issue in the library right now. So let's say that you're working on supporting charter schools, or you really do have a homelessness issue at the library. You might want to find somebody who has some local expertise. Or it could be, and I really believe this, is that I think that the best way for us to begin to diversify our profession is to start getting on people's radar when they're in high school before they choose their careers. So it could be that finding someone who's a teen in high school is the best way to do this. So I put all this out here to say there is no one right answer, but it is not typically just having someone who uses the library, because you probably know something about those people already. We're looking for people that know things that are not known right now. Okay, so board takeaway is that you are not only looking for people who are connected, but you're also looking for people who are polite and insightful. And I want to talk a little bit, this is just kind of a related thing. I'm fascinated by these review or interview processes that really get at the truth of how somebody behaves. And the best way that I've ever found to do this for board members, and again, every board has its own way about doing this, and if you can't influence it, then this won't help you much. But one of the things we did was when we had 7 board members, I would put them up on a panel with each other. And I would give them a discussion question, and that discussion question might be something like, you're walking through the grocery store and somebody comes up and they said, I really had a terrible service interaction with one of the staff members who couldn't help me work my new Kindle Fire. What do you think an appropriate board response would be for this? And on the one hand, as they begin to have this discussion, you're looking to see, do they have some understanding about boundaries, or do they understand that they're not going to jump in and try to mediate every conflict, but what you're really watching for is how they deal with each other. And if you put somebody in a board situation and they're consistently talking over the people around them, they're rolling their eyes, they're making snide comments, that's probably the kind of board member you're going to get. And so I just put it out there to say that if you can have influence over your interview process, try to let the board member exercise the skills you're looking for. And the skill is communication. Can they work collaboratively with other people on the board to make good decisions? So again, community connections, and then people who have the ability to be both polite and insightful. So I want to stop there and say I just want to roll back and Christine, is there anything here that I have missed in the chats, or does anybody have any questions about these two kinds of focuses? Clearly, key people that influence the feel of an institution are the kind of staff that you hire, where you're looking for connected people. And the second one is you're looking for board members who are also going to keep reminding you about what's going on in that larger environment. So go ahead.
So, Jamie, I've been tracking the chat, and there's been a lot of really insightful discussion between participants, and no questions that are unanswered at this point, but I see there's just been a few more comments that have come in here to draw your attention to. Bill just said, I get that involvement with outside groups and organizations is important, but how does one appropriately bring up the library to a group which is focused on entirely different issues? So I guess there's even a bit of a question there in what Bill just shared.
Well, fair enough. And I think that you're looking for those connections because it may not be obvious to you right now what that natural partnership would be. And I think that's a legitimate thing to ask somebody during the interview. So if they come in and they say, yeah, I'm involved in an auto mechanic vocational school. And you say, have you given any thought to how you could represent the interests of that group to the library? What kinds of things are they looking for? And again, it's this broader discussion, and it gives you an opportunity to explore things that you haven't thought about. There was another comment here is that it can be very difficult for people to serve time on boards. And often the people that you are most trying to reach, younger folks, are the ones with the least amount of free time. And I recognize that that's a challenge. But all that means is that you have to look harder. And so, I don't get into this too much in this workshop, but the idea about orientation is very important. You can bring somebody on board to say, regardless of the time that you have, we'll try to help you be a very efficient board member, and we'll try to minimize the time that you have, but use your time effectively to help us connect to the community. And a question here about how to better encourage staff that is amazing in so many ways, but aren't active in the community. Interesting. Let me get through the bulk of this, but I'll try to come back to that. And Crystal, I'll look for you for a reminder about that for me in case I let it slip. So I want to move now to the next layer where libraries start turning outward because they have a building project. And almost any architect worth his or her salt, and most boards will say, well, before we start doing this, let's have some kind of discussion with the community. And again, I've often heard people say in municipalities and libraries and counties and planning, they say, it's not just that we want your opinion, we want an informed opinion. The process of just saying, what do you want at the library is typically so broad that nobody knows quite how to respond to that. So I'm going to give you two examples of ways that you can respond. And so the first one is kind of a whiteboard exercise. And this is something that actually I believe I stole it from the state library. I saw it done around, I think it was about computing knowledge within a community. And so the idea is this. If you want to get useful responses from the public, I've been contracted to work with architects before, where I'll say there are 4 big trends that are driving change within the library. And one of them is, and I said, and I'll put it up like this, on this left-hand side, yes, the digital library continuum. On the left-hand side, I'll say, we're used to this idea that libraries are physical spaces, that we have content, and when you come in, what you're going to see are big rows of stacks, you're going to find lots of study tables, you're going to find chairs, there's going to be a couple of service desks, maybe a couple of small meeting rooms, but it's all about I'm coming in, I'm interacting with physical items. On the other side of this continuum, there is an all-digital library, and if you can imagine what that would look like, I'm coming in and what I'm seeing is an intensely wired, lots and lots of workstations, collaborative workstations, small group areas, demonstration technology, 3D printers. And so the truth of it is that at this moment in time, we really don't have libraries that are just all physical anymore. Very few. We really don't have libraries that are all digital. We still have libraries that are trying to do some mix. So you've already had a chance to play with this kind of whiteboard stuff. And now I'm looking for another single mark. And I was trying to figure out, Christine, do we want this to be in color? Is there a way to make this in color? So,
Yes.
so what I'm asking you to do, attendees, is to say, I want you to make a mark where you think your library falls on that continuum. There's no libraries at one end or the other, and if you feel like you've hit a balance between you, you would put an X in the center, but use a color, and there you go, that's okay, to say where you think your library is right now. So I'll just let you go ahead and put that first color up.
And if you're having trouble finding the colors, if you click on the marker, which is once again the second one down, further down you should see a color box that if you click on that will allow you to pick the color. Hopefully that makes sense for everyone.
Here, I like that. Well, so what we can see is that there is something of a spread among the attendees, right? So there are some who feel that, yeah, we really are over on the physical side, and others saying, no, we've taken some pretty good steps there. But what I like about this, and the beauty of this kind of big whiteboard continuum, is it gives people a very visual way. And if you're doing this within a single community, and people go up and they start to make these marks, they tend to cluster. So now I'm going to ask you, so I wonder if we can, Christine, get you to wipe it. And so the second piece of this is, I would say, in an exercise, so all the community is getting up and they're coming up and they're talking to each other and they're at this whiteboard and they're putting up a yellow sticky note or they're making a colored mark. And so now I would say to people, using this same continuum and knowing what you know about the community, where do you think your community wants you to be on this continuum in 3 to 5 years? And so, Christine, can you wipe this board? And I'm going to ask people to go again with a different color this time and say, where do you think your community wants you to be on this continuum? And I'm not sure I'm seeing anybody doing that. Christine, you still around? Well, I will flip on here to the next thing, but I hope that you kind of get the idea. Typically what I would do when I'm doing this exercise, there is a cluster of things where people say, here's where we are. And because they have now thought about what that space would look like, they've had a chance to talk about it with other people and share some social learning as they're up putting their little markers up there, you wind up with a picture, and I'm going to scroll back here for just a moment to this one. So in that exercise, I said, and I'll discuss this in a minute, yellow is where we are now, and blue is where do you think we're going to go? And very quickly, you get a visual representation that shows some consensus. And I always stop at this point and I'll say, you see on the lower left-hand corner here, there's a blue, where somebody said, no, I think, I don't hold with all this digital stuff. I would stop at that point where I'd say, we have an outlier opinion. Thank you so much. Can we explore that a little bit? Can you talk to me about why you did this? So to jump ahead again, there are 4 kinds of continuum here, and this comes from something, and again, maybe Crystal or Christine, I can get you to put up a link to this, but it's from a policy brief from ALA called Confronting the Future, Strategic Visions for the 21st Century Public Library. And these 4 continuum, one is from physical to digital that we just talked about. The second continuum is from individual to group. And I think this is very key for the things we're talking about today. We're used to individual transactions. But now as we start to support the community at large, we might be trying to figure out ways to provide services to larger groups. And so this might be, instead of individual resources, now we're providing meeting rooms or remote location access, or just even tables and chairs so people can come and have meetings. So we're moving to a new kind of service. And thank you, Crystal, for that link. The next one is this idea that there's a difference between collection space, where you want to come in and say, yeah, it's all about using things, checking things out. Or the other one, kind of in the maker station idea, no, I want to come to the library to be part of a sewing circle, to be part of, making Christmas decorations, of, doing 3D printing, but it doesn't all have to be technology. I actually want to make things. And so by discussing this with the audience, with the public, you are giving them a frame to say, this is the significant change that's driving things in the library world, but you're the expert. You're the community expert who is the only one who can tell us, what do you think the community actually makes of this and what's a good fit? And no community comes up with quite the same answer. And the last one is the difference between portal, and the idea is that our job is to take you to the world, is to have samples from everything that's from the world. And the second one, the archive, is that no, we're holding on to things that tell our story. We're taking us to the world, not bringing the world to us. And so after doing this with, here's the explanation, here's the continuum, come up and do today, come up and do where you think it needs to be, you wind up with a very rich and well-informed and very visual way to get lots and lots of feedback about the future of the library. So I offer that as one tool. Another one is, so here's the big takeaway, and here's what it is first, and then I'll give you the second approach, is that meaningful input from the public means that you have to give them a clear frame. You have to actually give them a shared vocabulary way to approach it, and then a clear and preferably visual process for that meaningful participation. And so one of the other ones that I'll just mention briefly is the Harwood Institute did a brilliant thing, and it's called Community Rhythms. And this is also available, Community Rhythms report from the Harwood Institute. And they basically say every community, whether it's 300 people or 300,000, goes through 5 cycles. And the first one is, they call it the waiting place. And this is where we believe somewhere in the community, somebody should do something. Not me, I haven't figured out what it is, haven't found who that person is, but somebody ought to do something. The second one is impasse. Things have gotten bad, and everybody can see it, and it's obvious. And the third one is catalytic. And here, typically 1 or 2 people, maybe from 2 different organizations, get together and do something. They start to make something happen. The fourth one is the one that the Chamber of Commerce says they want all the time, and that's growth. The community has taken off. Everybody's busy. There's big activities. There's staying late at night. There's building projects going up. There's new initiatives. And then the final stage, Harwood calls sustain and renew, but I call it I'm tired. I've been going to all these meetings for 6 months, and don't call me for a while because I haven't seen anybody in my family, and I just need some downtime. And then the whole process starts over. So when we were doing this building project, when I was working as a consultant on it, the concern the director had was, I don't think anybody's going to, be up for this. They're so worried about what's happening in the community. I could stand up and say, I'm not from here, but here's this frame about how communities work. Do you agree with that? People would say, yeah, I get the frame. And then I would say, so here's your sticky note, and come up and say, where is your community today? And when those folks who walked in, they would come up and they'd say, now they're talking to each other. And I, as facilitator, am not telling them things about their community. They are the experts for the community. And it gives them a way to put up something there to say, all right, now if we're at impasse, then what we need is catalytic. And so you have given people sort of a preview about how change might take place within the community. It gives focused, clear communication. And so I think this idea about acknowledging expertise, giving them a frame, and then letting them use their expertise is a powerful way to get engagement. And I see I have a question here that I'll come back to, but I'm not quite ready for that yet. So don't, again, Crystal, help me come back and collect this at the end. Okay, so next area that I think libraries look outward is for strategic planning. And I think it's the planning processes can be very complex. The basic idea is that all planning, however, begins with an environmental scan. You want to do a look around to see what's out there. I worked with one group that had done very intense, went to their organizations and held big community meetings, asked a bunch of questions, had all this information and research at the end, but then they weren't quite sure what to do with it. And so then the opportunity for the facilitator, or you may have people on your own team, is then to come and say, how do we boil that down to something that's actionable? And so I think this is a spot where I want to do, yeah, I think I better jump just into this process. And so I'm going to put out something here that I think is a profoundly simple, inexpensive way, and I have tested this in a number of different libraries, to do a community interview process to help you start to do a new long-range plan. And the idea is this. Step one, identify community leaders. It's a good staff exercise, it's a good board exercise to say, as we think about who the movers and shakers are in our community, whether or not they have any connection to the library, who are they? And I think it doesn't take long to brainstorm about 40 names. There are categories. You can say, I'm looking for business leaders, I'm looking for elected officials, I'm looking for civic leaders, I'm looking for not-for-profit, I'm looking for educational leaders, I'm looking for faith-based, and so just a list of them. And then the second step is that now you send out, and my recommendation is 2 reference librarians, if you can, to contact these people to say, we want to interview you at your place of business, your office, 1-hour interview. And they're typically very flattered. Okay, library wants to come and talk to me because I'm an expert in something. Great. And then the 2 librarians go. One is asking the questions, the other one is recording it, and you're doing an in-depth reference interview. The best questions I can offer to you are, as you think about your constituents over the next 18 to 24 months, what do you think the issues are that they're most concerned about? And then you just get them to talk about that, and you try to make sure that you understand it, ask some probing questions. And very quickly, powerful things begin to happen. Notice that you're not coming in to say, what can the library do for you? Because they don't know. That's not what they're an expert on. But they're talking about the thing that drives their passion. And so they're having fun. They're enjoying talking about it. And then they stop halfway through and they say, I'm sorry, who are you again? And you say, we're with the library. And they say, and why are you here? And you say, because we're trying to understand the community in which we operate and look for a place where we can add value. And in that moment, something magical happens. The people are looking at the library in a way they've never seen them before. It's not someone standing there with their hand out asking for money. It's somebody saying, I might be an asset to accomplish your goals. And that beginning of a discussion is the beginning of a relationship. Next step is, staff comes back, they analyze all the data from all the different people, and then typically it resolves into about 5 to 7 themes, because in every community, the same issues tend to come up over and over and over again, and often people in the community don't realize that. So then you present these findings to the community. So now you invite all the people you talk to come back for a debrief. This one is held at the library, and you say, A, we want to see if we got it right, and B, we're trying to see where we might make a difference. And so by presenting all this stuff, typically I find, column 1 is here's the theme, column 2 is, gee, who's working on all of these things? And no matter how large or small your community is, there are always people working on the same thing that don't talk to each other. And so it's a good way to connect them. And then finally you say, here is a gap, and here's something that fits into the library expertise. And then you go away after this meeting and select a single project. Where can we make a difference? In Douglas County, where we did this, the thing we kept hearing over and over again from people, and this was a profound insight from a faith-based minister in the area. And we said, what are your constituents worried about? He said, I used to be a grief counselor, and what I see is grief. People in Douglas County are all new. Nobody's from here. And so everybody misses home. There is a deep longing for community building. And so we took that as one of the themes, and the project that we built out of this, because there were also a big demographic changeover from 35 to 55 to over 55, people retiring, but maybe available for volunteer work. And we decided to create a new volunteer database that would be put together in conjunction with all the other municipal bodies in the community. And in the space of about 2 years, we brought 5,000 new volunteers into all of these different community organizations to give them a sense of community. So select a project and then budget for it and then do it and then go back and tell everybody that you did it. So notice that this process, that kind of interviewing everybody, you're making connections, you're understanding your community, and now you go from interviewer to community leader. Because often with these community leaders that come back to the library, they are seeing for the very first time a comprehensive community agenda. These are all the things the community is concerned about, and the library is here to help us address our issues. I've done this with several libraries now, and I find it incredibly compelling, and it is transformative. So I want to jump ahead now to the planning takeaway about that one, and that's that we're not alone, and that together we can do great things. And by teaming up with the expertise of this much broader group, we're not just focusing on one institution, we're assembling all of the social assets, and we're earning our reputation on the basis of our ability to advance a much larger agenda, that we're part of something larger than ourselves. A few more slides, and then I'll come back for some of these questions. The last one is the notion of advocacy. And in 2019, and I think that this has been an issue for the past 50 years, the public sector is in trouble. As we saw in the LCLC report, we have fewer people fewer libraries that make it to the ballot or win when they do. Support for the public institution is falling. There is a belief that taxes are inherently evil, even when we can demonstrate that it's way cheaper, way more cost-effective to do that than charging as you go. But advocacy begins with listening. And again, this idea, if you're trying to build support, I want to say it doesn't start with I show up in a meeting and bang on the table and say, library, 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 give me money. I come in and I say, excuse me, that the things that we're working on together are so important that the library will dedicate itself to advancing these things in ways that are also commensurate with our mission. You know, if the big issue is we have a dearth of water, the library can't make it rain, but we can certainly figure out ways to have panel discussions about water. We can do demonstrations xeriscaping on our lots. You know, we can build up our resources about water uses in the West. You know, there are all kinds of ways that there are appropriate library responses. But I want to keep it down to that point of choosing one big project to make it obvious. So the 3 steps of advocacy is first to show up. And I remember when I was first trying to figure out how to be a community player, I would ask people, so where do all the movers and shakers show up? And it might be a bar after a community meeting. It might be the community meeting itself. And I find that the first time you show up, people say, oh, who are you? But if you keep showing up and keep showing up, then eventually they assume you must be one of the power players because you're always where everybody else is. And then you pay attention to the things that people talk about, and then you keep in touch. And I'll give you an example from the time when I was the library administrator at Greeley. I went to a meeting where my boss, I didn't have a board, I had one person. They were talking about a bunch of development things and nobody knew much about it. I got together with my reference librarians, presented to my boss, here is a briefing paper so that the next time you show up at this meeting, you are the smartest person in the room about this. And of course, I became a favored member of that person's department because I made her look good. And I think that idea about showing up at the meeting, saying, here's what people are asking about, and I'm going to keep coming back to stay in touch with you, this makes, it demonstrates your value, again, as a social asset, and it also shows that you can follow through, that you continue to manage these relationships. So again, what this tells us is that advocacy is all about the cultivation of relationships and knowledge, and what we're after is achieving shared goals. And we need to kind of come back to claim our role as community leader. So I've got my debrief up here now, and Crystal, I want to go back to questions I may have missed. Can we go back and address some of those now?
Yeah, so Lori asked the question about how do we reach folks in our communities who are not yet library users. It says we're pretty good at talking to our current engaged patrons, but we need to serve the whole community.
Exactly, and I think that that kind of community interview process that I talk about, and I'll see if I can back up to that slide, I think this is the systematic way that you get out of that. So if I'm talking to people and I keep saying, tell me who the movers and shakers are, the last question I ask when I interview a mover and shaker is, who else should I talk to? And so by talking to those folks who are, by definition, outside the library world, I'm not bringing them into the library, I'm asking them to talk about their world. I get that systematic approach to people who may not use the library. But just that process of interviewing them puts them on my radar, me on their radar, and it begins to give me some ideas about ways I can reach out to further groups and individuals. So I think that's the answer. And so that it comes down to a systematic approach by identifying existing groups and movers and shakers by keep asking who's doing something in any arena that we can think of. Hope that makes sense. Is there another question?
Yeah, so Meg had a question earlier on when we were talking about staff and asked for any suggestions for how to better encourage staff. That is amazing. The staff are amazing in so many ways, but they aren't active in the community. So how might you be able to motivate them to want to be more active and community-centered?
And I think that this is very true for a lot of us, that we find that we've inherited staffs where they again, may be amazing and very gifted as library people, but they're not community connected. And I guess I think there are a number of different ways to do this. You can do things like build up a corporate sharing program that if somebody is a member of something and you want to donate some time or money to that, is there some way that the library can match that? One of the things that I remember a library in West Virginia did was they had one day where instead of a staff day, it was a volunteer day. And all the staff members, they shut the library and they went out and they volunteered at a number of other community organizations. So it gave them a chance to sort of survey and demonstrate that the library was serious about supporting other people in the community. Another thing that can be done is do kind of an open house of other volunteer opportunities. So let's say that you are reaching out to find as many community groups out there as you can, and you invite them all come in and do an open house. Just talk about what they do, and then you encourage your staff to go there, and you say, we're actually going to put on your employee improvement plan for the year that you're going to pick a community organization that has some goal commensurate with the library's mission, and we'll give you some work time to do that. So those are just some of the strategies I would recommend.
Great. I think that's all the questions that we had, but I wanted to close, give you some time to, have any closing thoughts, and I know you've got like a closing slide to share. And going back to the responses to why bother, I thought this was great from Beth. She said that the library wants to be serving people in the ways they want to be served, being responsive, respectful, and relevant. So I thought that was a nice closing thought around the community-centered library idea. Do you have any other closing thoughts to add to that before we wrap up?
I do. I just said, so the idea is, why do we turn outwards? I think we do that to understand the context of our operations, to make a difference, to grow support, to serve the community that supports us. And then how do we do that? It begins with human capital, with the staff and the board, and we constantly recruit those who are connected, and we encourage those who are already on board to get connected. For building projects, that we give a planning context, and then we appeal to the wisdom of the community. And for planning and advocacy, it's all about, instead of doing things by accident or just kind of picking things up just by paying marginal attention, we're systematically developing relationships that are predicated on mutual goals, listening, action, and clear messaging. We continue to stay in touch with the people we serve. So with that, I'll take any other final questions, or if there's any other, Christine or Crystal, any things that we have to wrap up here?
Well, I think we've got all that all the questions, and again, there was a lot of really great discussion in the chat. We appreciate everybody participating in that. If you have feedback for today's webinar, please take the survey that we have. And Jamie, I just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise and having a conversation with us about this. It's really nice to participate in a dialogue about this topic. So thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.